Okay, so good evening. And tonight we're going to be covering chapters 20 through 23 of Genesis. So we get to see Isaac get born tonight, and then we get to see him almost get offered up as a sacrifice. So some good chapters here. Let's begin. We'll look at chapter 20, but before we start reading it, I want to do some introductory things here for you. I want to point out there's a few interesting similarities between some of the ideas and themes from chapters 18 and 19, and also what we see here. So it helps connect this chapter in certain ways to the ones that we just read. First of all, we have a vulnerable female in chapter 20. Who is that vulnerable female? Do you know the story here in chapter 20? Remind yourselves. Yeah. So the vulnerable female is Sarah because Abraham does what? Lies again about her. Okay, who's the vulnerable female in 19? Actually, we could say females. This is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot's daughters, yeah. Luke's getting an A tonight. He's on target. Okay, so there's also judgment. Obviously, in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, we have judgment. And here tonight, we'll see a judgment come on the king Abimelech, even though what he does unknowingly, similar to Pharaoh. In both stories, Abraham acts as an intercessor. We remember the famous prayer and plea for Sodom. And tonight he's going to intercede on behalf of Abimelech, and God's going to answer the prayer and remove the plague or the sickness that's on his house. The theme of righteousness is going to pop up again. And remember, Abram's whole prayer was, will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? And what if there's 50 righteous? And shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And this idea will come up again here in chapter 20. And then we have an interesting contrast. The behavior of a foreigner in a land not theirs. Now, that sounds a little abstract, so let me explain what we're talking about. In the story of Sodom, the residents threaten the stranger Lot. Remember, they say, you've only come here recently and you're a stranger in our midst, and are you going to judge us? And they threaten him, and the angels end up saving his life. In today's story, Abraham is the stranger. He is sojourning in a place called Gerar, which is in southwestern part of Canaan. And he ends up threatening the residents because of this lie about his wife, and then the plague that comes on, at least the king and his family. But then he ends up turning around and blessing them when he intercedes for them after he gets found out about. Okay? So it's always good when we read the scripture, not only to say, gee, does this remind me of another story in scripture, so that we can do that compare and contrast thing, but also to say, how does this chapter connect with the one that I just read? Is there a connection? And usually, of course, there's some kind of connection because it's a story that's being told. And when you can find certain ideas like this that are either being repeated or maybe there's a contrast involved, that's another way of sort of getting at the message that God wants us to see. Now, I also want to suggest that I think chapter 20 serves several purposes. The first thing is that it delays the birth story, and it causes the reader to wait, just as Abraham and Sarah are waiting on the birth of this child. So the child's birth was announced in chapter 18, actually originally in 17, but then in 18 again. And then we have the story of Sodom in 19, and now we have this story in 20. So we're like, okay, when's this birth going to happen? Secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, it creates a crisis by bringing the promise into question. Here is Abram giving his wife away again on the eve when he's supposed to be making her pregnant and she's going to give birth to a son. And then third, it demonstrates the character of God, just as it did in the previous story where Abraham lied about his wife, how God was true to his word. He said, those who curse you, I will curse. Those who bless you, I will bless. And he promised to bless Abraham. And we see all of those things happening in this story as well. Thoughts or questions on anything that we've covered here in these introductory thoughts? Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and start reading then in chapter 20. And let's look first of all at verses 1 through 7. Okay, Blake?
From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And he sojourned to Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now Abimelech had not approached her. So he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and in the innocence of my mind, I have done this. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours.
Okay, thanks, Blake. So we read that Abram's in a little bit different part of Canaan here from where he's previously been, this area of Gerar. And as I said, this is sort of southwest Canaan. So what we mean by that is like down by the cities of Gaza. I don't know if that helps you guys, if you know a map of Israel. Usually I have maps galore to put up, but I don't have one for this particular story. So anyway, the usual thing happens here in verse 2. Abram said of Sarah, his wife, she's my sister. And lo and behold, the same problem happens again. The king of the land takes her for his wife. So again, it's not just some individual where perhaps Abraham could refuse. It's the king. And so this once again causes a huge problem, obviously, for Abram and Sarah. Now, Sarah's 90 years old now. Before, it was said that she was a beautiful woman and that she was attractive to the Egyptians and to Pharaoh. That's not said here. So why in the world would Abimelech be interested in marrying her? She's rich, and she has a rich brother, right? Okay, so what benefit then is that to Abimelech?
Quite political in some nature.
Yes, exactly. So in the ancient world, what kings often did is they married women either from very wealthy aristocratic families or they married the daughters of other kings. We've already seen that Abraham is a conqueror of kings back in chapter 14, and that he is a powerful individual. Later on, he's going to be called a mighty prince of God when we get to chapter 23. So this might be seen as sort of a political treaty between Abraham and Abimelech, or it may simply be that Abimelech recognizes that Abraham is a very wealthy and powerful man, and it would be advantageous to marry into the family. So thinking that Sarah is his sister, Abimelech takes her for a wife. Now, we didn't find out in the last story how Pharaoh heard that Sarah was actually Abraham's wife. But in this story, we're told how Abimelech finds out and what happens. Yes, God comes in a dream. There are a lot of dreams in the book of Genesis, and we're going to see plenty more as we move forward here. So God comes to him in a dream. We might call it a nightmare because he says, indeed, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. But in verse 4, we're told very clearly, Abimelech had not come near her. Okay, now there was some doubt in the previous story that maybe Pharaoh had relations with Sarah, but here we're told very clearly. Why is it important that we know that piece of information here? Exactly. This way we know that Isaac is indeed Abraham's baby and not Abimelech's. Okay, so Abimelech says, Lord, will you slay a righteous nation also? So this sounds very similar to Abraham's prayer, will you slay the righteous with the wicked? Will not the just of all the earth do right? And he's pleading with the Lord in his dream. Did he not say to me, she's my sister? And she even herself said, he's my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocence of my hands, I've done this. So Abimelech's pleading his case and saying, look, I'm totally innocent in this. I did not purposely try to steal another man's wife. And God admits that this is indeed the case in verse 6. He says, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. And then we see why he had not had relations with Sarah, because God says, for I also withheld you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Okay, so it's clear then that even though Abimelech hasn't purposely done anything wrong, he's got to make the situation right. And God says in verse 7, restore the man's wife, for he's a prophet, and he will pray for you. But if you don't restore her, know that you surely shall die, you and all who are yours. In this story and in the previous one where Abraham lies to Pharaoh, we have a situation where we have a Gentile who really ends up looking more righteous than the person that God has chosen to be the bearer of the promised seed, right? And I think there's a big lesson here for us as believers, because sometimes we can become arrogant and look down our nose at unbelievers. And sometimes unbelievers show much more grace and kindness than we do. And remember that Abraham was called to be a blessing to the nations. And here he is once again bringing a curse on this particular king and his people. So I think there's a rebuke here for the people of God in this story that we're supposed to hear and ask ourselves the question, okay, as a Christian, am I being a light to the world? Am I being a blessing to those that I come into contact with, or am I bringing a curse into their lives by the things I say and the ways that I act and the way that I treat them? Okay. Do you guys have any thoughts on verses 1 through 7?
It doesn't really say how Abraham got himself in this situation again. Like, I understand in Egypt, he was kind of in a lowly spot at that point. But this time he had his whole crew with him, and he was rich and powerful. How the heck did this happen?
We're going to see when he gives his excuses to Abimelech that he gives a reason, but all of his reasons sound pretty flimsy. Because as you point out, he's in a very different position here. He's a very wealthy and powerful man. And he should have learned by now that God would protect him, right? God's been pretty good at watching over Abram through all these years. Okay, good point. Anything else? Okay, so let's go ahead and read verses 8 through 18.
So Abimelech rose early in the morning, called all his servants, and told all these things in their hearing, and the men were very much afraid. And Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? How have I offended you that you have brought on me and on my kingdom to great sin? You have done deeds to me that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you have in view that you have done this thing?" And Abraham said, "Because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will kill me on account of my wife. But indeed she is truly my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. She became my wife. And it came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house that I said to her, 'This is your kindness that you should do for me in every place wherever we go. Say of me, he is my brother.' Then Abimelech took sheep, oxen, and male and female servants, and gave them to Abraham, and restored Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, 'See, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you.' Then to Sarah he said, 'Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Indeed, this vindicates you before all who are with you, before everybody.' But she was rebuked. So Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female servants. Then they bore children, for the Lord had closed up all the wounds of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife.
Okay, thanks, Luke. I like the way you started with the Hebrew pronunciation, Abimelech, and then you switched to the English pronunciation, Abimelech, which is fine. But it caused me to want to point out the meaning of Abimelech or Abimelech's name. Does anyone know what it is, what it means? Okay, yeah, so Melech is the word in Hebrew for king. And remember, any word that begins with A-B means what? Father. And the I in Hebrew is my. So we have my father is king. Okay. And this seems to be either a family name or a throne name, because later on in the story of Isaac, we're going to have another Abimelech. But it can't possibly be the same Abimelech because it's about 90 years later. So obviously this is either a name that runs in the family or a name that designates the king in this over this particular kingdom. Okay, so notice in verse 8, he doesn't waste any time. It says he rose early in the morning and called his servants, and he told them everything, and it said the men were very much afraid. Now that's important, because when Abimelech says to Abraham, "Why did you do this to me?" what is one of the things that Abraham says?
He thought there was no fear of God.
Right. So obviously a total misjudgment of the people, because when Abimelech tells his men about the dream, it says they were very much afraid. So Abraham underestimates these people and their reverence for God. Notice in verse 10, Abimelech, when he's accusing Abraham, says, "What did you have in view that you have done this thing?" In other words, here's our question again in Genesis. What have you done? And so Abraham's first answer, as we pointed out, is, "I thought surely there's no fear of God, and they will kill me on account of my wife." So we've already discussed how that shows a great lack of faith in God's promise of protection over Abraham, and how God has protected him over the last 24, 25 years. And then we get some new information in verse 12 that we didn't get in the previous story, right? So what's the new info here, Corinna?
That he told her to say that? Is that what you mean?
Even a little before that, verse 12.
That she is his sister.
That she truly
Did
is
you not
his
say
sister.
that the last time?
No, this is new information here. So we didn't know this. And he says, "She's the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother." So Abraham, we find out, actually married his half-sister. Clearly something that under the law of Moses was prohibited from happening. And this and many other things in Genesis show that it's a legitimate account of the way things were back then. Some people say, oh, Genesis wasn't written by Moses. It was written hundreds, maybe even thousands of years later, and it doesn't reflect the true life and times of Abraham. But one of the things that conservative Bible scholars argue is that if it had been written thousands of years later, someone who knew the Mosaic law certainly wouldn't have Abraham marrying his half-sister, because that would be a violation of the law. So we have little things like this throughout the story, things that the patriarchs do that the law of Moses says don't do, which then suggests that this is really a reflection of the way they lived in their life. So this is an example of that. But this is a weak excuse, isn't it? Well, she really is my sister. It's like, yeah, so that meant you didn't mean to deceive me? I don't think so. Yeah, and then the other point you were mentioning, Corinna, in verse 13, apparently this was a very common practice of Abraham. So he said, wherever we go, this is what I want you to say. And apparently Sarah agrees to do that. So we have two instances where that happens. There may have been more, we don't know. But God only chose to talk about these two instances, if there were other instances. So what does Abimelech do then? After giving Sarah back, he does some other things. He doesn't just give her back. Abraham gets even richer, doesn't he? Why do you suppose that he gives Abraham all this stuff?
Same reason the Pharaoh did.
Same reason the Pharaoh did. Fear of God, and because there has been an offense, even though it was an unintended offense, this is a way of making up for that offense. It's a way of seeking forgiveness, I guess you could say. And then we're told that Abimelech in verse 16 also gives 1,000 pieces of silver. Indeed, this vindicates you, he says to Sarah. Behold, all who are with you and before all who are with you and before everybody. Thus she was rebuked. So what's going on here with the 1,000 pieces of silver? What does he say? This is to do what? To vindicate you. So basically, it's a way of establishing that he had not had relations with her. He's paying what would normally be a bride price, only he's doing it after the fact when she's given back to Abraham. Okay? And some have pointed out that these are, Abimelech may not have totally been above board with everything, because we don't hear about any bride price being paid before this. So maybe he sort of did intimidate Abraham into this transaction, but here he's making good by giving Abraham all of these riches. Now, I like what he says in verse 16, though. I think there's a little sarcasm here. Then to Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Okay. It's too bad we can't read tone into the scripture, right? Sometimes it's really obvious, though, when something is being said sarcastically, and I think that's probably the case here. Now, God had told Abimelech that Abraham would pray for him and that he would be restored. And so in verse 17, this is what we have. Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, his female servants. Then they bore children. So we get an idea here as to what was happening in Abimelech's household. Some sort of sickness, disease, plague had fallen upon his house that had not allowed him to have relations with his wives. Okay? And this is probably what God also meant when he said, I prevented you from having relations with Sarah. It was this, whatever this is, that came upon him. But as Abraham prays, this sickness is removed. And we're even told in verse 18, for the Lord had closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abram's wife. So we learned that Abimelech was doing okay with wives. It talks about plural here. He had more than one. Typical of an ancient king, they seemed to always gather harems around them. Again, part of it was to marry into wealthy families or to make treaties with other kings. Okay, so in the end, in a roundabout way, Abraham ends up being a blessing to Abimelech, at least in the sense that he gets this curse removed that he was responsible for in the first place. You know, if you're going to treat somebody bad and unfairly, the least you can do is try to make it right. So he does that. Okay, any other thoughts on this chapter? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is like mostly about Sarah, I guess. I've heard it taught where like in this situation, Sarah didn't do anything wrong because she was listening to Abraham, so that was kind of like covered by Abraham. So I'm assuming I feel like.
Yeah, well, I would say that Abraham has to bear most of the responsibility because he's the head of the family. He's the one that proposed this arrangement. And being a good wife, Sarah's gone along with it. But then, of course, we all have the freedom of choice, don't we? So I think she bears some responsibility in it. But certainly Abraham should shoulder the major share of the blame. That's my opinion on it. Yeah. Good question. Anything else? All right, we're going to move into chapter 21. That's the end of this slideshow, so I need to pull up a new set of slides. So give me just a second to do that. Okay, so Genesis 21, and finally we come to the long-awaited birth of Abraham's son. Abraham waited how many years for the birth of Isaac? How many? Not quite, 25 years. From the time he came into Canaan, we were told he was 75. And as we're going to see in this story, Abraham is 100 when Isaac is born. That's 25 long years. And as we talked about the other night, it's easy to understand how, from a human point of view, Abraham and Sarah were getting very desperate and starting to give up that this promise could ever come true. And I think that we should sympathize with that, because if we were in their shoes, we would no doubt have done the same, maybe even worse than Abraham and Sarah did. Also, I think it's interesting that this son is not born till chapter 21, and we met Abraham and Sarah back at the end of chapter 11, and we were told she was barren and could not have children. So we've waited a long time as readers, reading through the story. So we get a little bit of the sense of the wait that Abraham and Sarah had for this promise to be fulfilled. So again, in the way the story is told to us, it communicates a certain amount of feeling and a certain amount of empathy, seeing what Abram and Sarah have gone through during these years. Okay, so in verses 1 through 7, let's read about this happy occasion.
Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age.
So these are 7 happy verses here. The Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. Okay, words of God's faithfulness. You can trust his promise. And It's emphasized in verse 2 that Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age. So we're reminded this was a miraculous birth because this, humanly speaking, should not have happened. And then we see Abraham's obedience in the next two verses. He was told to name his son Isaac, and that's what he does. And then on the 8th day, he has Isaac circumcised, and we're told as God had commanded him. So reminding us here that Abraham is being obedient to the covenant that he made with God. So we're given Abraham's age in verse 5. He's 100, which made Sarah how old when she gave birth? 90. Yeah, because she's 10 years younger. And then we have these great two verses. We get to see Sarah's joy. And she makes a joke of Isaac's name, doesn't she? God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. So God has made me Isaac, and all who hear will Isaac with me. So as we said last night, that laughter of unbelief that we saw both from Abraham and Sarah now becomes the laughter of joy as they're just blown away with God's goodness, God's power in bringing this about. And she says, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I've borne him a son in his old age. So great stuff there. Any thoughts or questions from you guys? So we wait a long time for this to happen, and it's a great story of God's faithfulness and a great story of celebration. Okay, well, the story moves on in verses 8 through 13 as we see some problems begin to develop in the family now that there are two of these sons living, so to speak, under the same tent or under the same roof. So let's go ahead and read verses 8 through 13.
So the child grew and was weaned. Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had born to Abraham, scoffing. Therefore she said to Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. But God said to Abraham, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice. For in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed.
Okay, so verse 8, we cover a few years here. The child grew and was weaned. We don't know exactly how old this makes Isaac, but we do know that in the ancient world that mothers nursed children much longer than they do today. We have a text in a book from the intertestamental period, 2nd Maccabees. You've probably heard of the books of Maccabees. And there it talks about a child being weaned after 3 years. So we can make an educated guess here that Isaac is 3 years old, maybe 4 years old, somewhere in that neighborhood. Okay, so he's still very young, but he's no longer just a baby. And we're told that Abram made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. Why do you suppose they're having a feast here? What do we know about children in the ancient world? They are an asset to their parents. Yeah, firstborn son's always celebrated, and although Hagar might argue that Ishmael's the firstborn, when it comes to the promise of God, Isaac is. Okay, so in the ancient world, a lot of babies didn't survive, right? There was a high infant mortality rate. Sometimes they would die in the womb, sometimes they would die in the process of the birth, and sometimes they would sickly die due to sickness in the first months or years of their life. So if a child reached this point of being weaned, again about 3 years old or so, this was cause for great celebration because they had made it through the most dangerous period when children normally died. So this is a common thing to do in the ancient world when a child reached this point. So they're having a big party. Now, you guys can picture this. You have a big family event. It's supposed to be a big day of celebration, and two family members get into it. And it ruins the whole party, right? So Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abram, scoffing. Now, the New King James says scoffing. Does anybody have anything different? Laughing. Okay. What have you got?
Oh, I was just saying Isaac.
Isaacing. Yeah, it's our word again. So Sarah saw the son of Hagar. Notice he's not even called by name here. It kind of shows the contempt that Sarah has for him. She sees the son of Hagar, Isaacing. Okay, and probably this idea of scoffing or making fun of is a good translation in this particular case. Over in Genesis chapter 39, verses 14 and 17, this is the story of Joseph when Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. And she uses this word twice, and she says that he has brought a Hebrew in to Isaac us. Clearly in that context, it means to mock us or to make fun of us. And Paul uses it similarly in Galatians 4:29. He refers to this story, and he talks about how Ishmael persecuted the son of promise. So this idea of scoffing, making fun of, bullying, whatever, seems to fit what Ishmael is doing here. And obviously, this just ticks Sarah off to no end. And she's had it. She storms to Abraham and says, "Cast out this bondwoman and her son. For the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac." So she pulls social rank here on him. This is just a maid and her son. They have no right to be doing what they're doing, so get rid of them. Okay, and verse 11 says, "And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight." That is a very mild translation of what the Hebrew says here. Abraham is hot. He is angry, angry, angry. This is an expression that is sometimes used of someone who's so angry that they kill somebody else. So Abraham is very upset about this whole idea of casting out his son Ishmael. But God comes to him in verse 12 and says, "Do not let it be displeasing in your sight." In other words, don't get upset about this because of the lad or because of the bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, now catch this phrase, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Where have we seen that expression before, listening to the voice of one's wife? Seen it a couple places.
Not in a positive connotation, but like Eve to Adam.
Yeah, it's every time before it's been a negative connotation. So Eve to Adam. Where's the other one? Do you remember? We saw it just last night. Yes, exactly, about Hagar. And it said that Abraham listened to the voice of his wife and he took Hagar. So I like this example here where God says, listen to the voice of your wife, because the previous two are negative. And we could get the idea that the word of God is saying a husband should never listen to the voice of his wife. But clearly it's context that makes the difference. Eve's idea was a bad idea. Sarah's idea in chapter 16 with Hagar was a bad idea. But here, even though Sarah's angry and wants to cast him out, God says, this is my will and this is what I want. So listen to the voice of your wife. Now, God does try to soothe Abraham's frazzled nerves by saying in verse 13, "Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed." God's faithfulness again in blessing even Ishmael in this case. Okay, any thoughts on these verses? Questions? Okay, let's go ahead and read verses 14 through 21 as Hagar and Ishmael are kicked out of the family.
So Abraham got up early the next morning, prepared food in a container of water, and strapped them on Hagar's shoulders. Then he sent her away with their son, and she wandered aimlessly in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water was gone, she put the boy in the shade of a bush. Then she went and sat down by herself about 100 yards away. I don't want to watch the boy die, she said as she burst into tears. But God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. Hagar, what's wrong? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Go to him and comfort him, for I will make a great nation from his descendants. Then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well full of water. She quickly filled her water container and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy as he grew up in the wilderness. He became a skillful archer, and he settled in the wilderness of Paran. His mother arranged for him to marry a woman from the land of Egypt.
Okay, thank you. So every time Abraham has an unpleasant task to perform, we're told that he rises early in the morning. In other words, he doesn't procrastinate. He doesn't put it off. He is obedient to what God tells him to do. We know this was a very painful experience for Abraham because he had been so upset that Sarah would suggest such a thing. So he rises early in the morning, gives them bread and water, or food and water, and they go on their way. But where does she go? She doesn't know where to go. And so it says in 14, she wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, so looking for a place to call home. And finally, they started to run out of provisions. They ran out of water. Now, what does this story remind you of? Has similarities with another story that we've already read. Read it last night. This first time that Hagar has left the family? No. Is it the first time where she was desperate after she was, out in the wilderness? Did an angel of God come to her the first time? Yes. Does he come to her again? Yes. So there's a lot of similarities between this encounter and what happened back in chapter 16. And I've got a slide. I'm going to put up all the similarities between these two stories. It's really interesting. But we'll do that after our break. So once again, God comes to the rescue in verse 17. God heard the voice of the lad. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, "What ails you, Hagar? Fear not. God has heard the voice of the lad where he is." There's that wordplay again. God has heard. Ishmael, God hears. Now, how old was Ishmael have been at this point? Well, he was 14 when Isaac was born. And if Isaac was about 3, this would mean he's about 17 years old. Okay, so he's a teenager. So when we read words like the boy or the lad, we shouldn't think this is a 7, 8, 9-year-old kid. This is a 17-year-old, roughly. And but nonetheless, Hagar he's gotten to the point where she's afraid he's going to die, and she can't bear to see his death. So she puts him down under a tree, and she goes a distance away. And this is when God appears. And then in 18, God makes the promise to her, "Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him with your hand, and I will make him a great nation." Wow, this is the promise given to Abraham. I will make of you a great nation. So this is very gracious of God, even though Ishmael was sort of the unplanned son in the sense that it wasn't God's way to fulfill the promise. yet God is still going to be gracious and bless Ishmael. And then it just so happens that there's a well of water right nearby. In verse 19, God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. Remember, in the last story, she was near a well of water and didn't realize it. And what did she call God on that occasion? The God who sees. And here, this God who sees opens her eyes so that she can see. And from that point on, somehow, with God's help, Hagar and Ishmael end up being fine, because we're told in verse 20, God was with the lad. He grew and dwelt in the wilderness. And in verse 21, his mother took a wife for him. No surprise. Where does the wife come from? Egypt, because Hagar herself is Egyptian, so she has connections with the land of Egypt. So the descendants of Ishmael are actually half Abraham's seed and half of Egyptian descent. That's kind of interesting. Okay, so we'll pause there for now. And when we come back, we'll look at a comparison between these stories, and then we'll pick up the next section in Genesis. Okay, so before we look at the comparisons between verses 14 through 21 with the previous story of Hagar and Ishmael, let's look at the end of chapter 21 here. And we'll cover verses 22 through 34. And Abimelech comes back into the story here, and he and Abraham make a covenant together. So, Eva, is it your turn? Okay. Did you get it?
Yeah, that's good.
That's easy.
I'll just get one before yeah.
Oh, when I read.
I just get one like this. It's easier.
All right. You could get one of Eva. She's going to be reading. Sorry, everyone on YouTube. We're having the class filmed twice over here.
And it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore, swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, with my offspring, or with my posterity, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will do to me and to the land in which you have dwelt. And Abraham said, I will swear. Then Abraham rebuked Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized. And Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor had I heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. And Abraham sent 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Then Abimelech asked Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs which you've set by themselves? And he said, you will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that they may be my witness that I have done this well. Therefore he called that place Beersheba, because the two of them swore an oath there. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. So Abimelech rose with Phicol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days.
Okay, that's a long passage. Do you remember anything you read with Jamie filming you so closely?
I didn't even know he was going.
Oh, yeah.
I knew I was reading.
Okay. So when in verse 22, we see that Abimelech comes to speak with Abraham again, but he doesn't come alone, does he? He brings the commander of his army. So he says something really powerful, though, in verse 22. He says, God is with you in all that you do. So in spite of some of Abraham's problems of not always representing the Lord properly, as he didn't to Abimelech back in chapter 20, he is being a good witness as Abimelech and others around Abraham are seeing the way that the God of Abraham blesses him. And it seems that Abimelech is actually afraid of Abraham. Now, why might he be afraid? And then we'll look at some evidence that suggests that he is.
Probably because of the dream that he had Sarah with him.
He knows Abraham has a very powerful God that can bring plagues on people. He knows Abraham's very wealthy, very powerful. We've already seen that he has 318 trained soldiers in his entourage. So Abimelech says in verse 23, "Now therefore swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, with my offspring, or with my posterity." So this shows Abimelech's fear of Abraham. And why would he be worried that Abraham might deal falsely with him?
Because of his experience with Sarah.
How about past experience? Yeah, that we just read about in chapter 20. So it's clear here that this is the language of a covenant, because when Abimelech comes and he asks Abraham to take an oath, swear to me by God, and that you'll not only not deal falsely with me, but with my offspring, he's making a covenant so that not only Abraham, but future generations will observe this covenant together. And he finishes up by saying, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will do to me and to the land in which you have dwelt. So Abimelech tries to say, look, I've been really good to you, let you dwell in the land. I've given you all this stuff to vindicate your wife. So I want you to swear that you're going to treat me well as well. But Abimelech, as I mentioned, is not alone. He has the commander of his army with him. So this is a little bit of persuasion. He's got a little muscle with him in case Abraham doesn't want to agree to it. But verse 24, we're told that Abraham said, I will swear. But before they make this covenant, we find out that Abraham does have some grievances, that he hasn't been treated perfectly by everyone in the land that Abimelech rules. And so what's the problem that Abraham complains about?
The well.
The well of water, right? Apparently this is a well that Abraham has dug, but the servants of Abimelech have seized it and taken it away from Abraham. So this is significant too, in the sense that as a well that Abraham dug, this is really the first thing in the land of Canaan that he can claim that is his. And now it's been taken away from him by Abimelech's servants. How does Abimelech respond?
He says he hasn't heard of it.
Right, I didn't know it. We know from chapter 20 that at least in certain ways, he has a fear of God and he seems to be a person of integrity. So we could probably just take him at his word here, although we don't know 100% for sure. If we do take him at his word that he didn't know anything, then he is a bit of an inept ruler in not knowing what his servants are up to. But nonetheless, they agree to this covenant. And so Abraham takes sheep, oxen, and gives them to Abimelech. Maybe some of the sheep and oxen that Abimelech had originally given to him. And we're told that the two of them make a covenant here in verse 27. But then Abraham does something unusual. He takes 7 ewe lambs of the flock and sets them by himself. And even Abimelech doesn't know what's going on. So in verse 29, it said, Abimelech asked Abraham, what's the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs, which you have set by themselves? And he says, you will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that they may be witness that I have dug this well. So Abraham's wanting to not only is he willing to agree to this covenant? But he wants Abimelech to say, right, we're going to give the well back to you. The well is yours. And these 7 lambs are a witness, so to speak, of this event taking place. So then we get a play on the name of this place. Verse 31, therefore he called that place Beersheba because the 2 of them swore an oath there. Now, the word Beersheba or Beersheba, bear we've seen before. What does it mean? B-E-E-R? Means well. Sheba in Hebrew means either the number 7 or it means the word oath. And so we have 7 ewe lambs in the story, and we have Abraham swearing an oath. So there's a word play on both of these ideas, on the number 7 and on the word oath. By the way, we've had several Israeli students from the past who live in Beersheba who came here to Bible college. And I actually had the opportunity to go visit some of them and stay with their parents in Beersheba. I'm going to show you a picture in just a moment of my visit there. Verse 32, thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. So Abimelech arose with Phicol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. So let's pause there for a moment. So everything seems to have worked out fine. Abimelech had some trust issues with Abraham. Abraham was upset because property had been stolen away from him. And this seems to resolve itself, and now there's peace between Abraham and the people of Abimelech. So once again, Abraham ends up being a blessing to another people group in the land of Canaan. Later on, we're going to see that these people are called Philistines, or Philistines if you're English. They do not appear to be the Philistines that David will later encounter, but an earlier group of people that have been given this label as well. So I wanted to show you, when I was in Beersheba, I had the opportunity to go to the ancient city of Beersheba. Now this particular city only goes back to 1000 BC, whereas Abraham lived around 2000 BC, okay? So Abraham wouldn't have been in this particular city, but this is in the area of Beersheba, and this well that I'm standing in front of is called Abraham's well. So it's possible this could be the very well, or it could just be because it's here by this city of Beersheba that they said, hey, let's call this Abraham's well because we know he dug a well in this area. Okay, but either way, there you go. There are, this is a drier area in Israel. It's in the south. And so the digging of wells is very important to have a source of water for both your family and for your flocks. Now in 33 and 34, we read that Abram planted a tamarisk tree, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Here we have another name for God. Okay, so you might want to jot this one down. Keep tabs on your list of the names of God. As I said, you might want to know those for next Tuesday's exam. So the Lord, the everlasting God, Lord is obviously Yahweh, and we've seen that before. The everlasting God is El Olam, O-L-A-M, okay? El Olam. So what's the significance of Abram planting this tree and then calling on the everlasting God?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Sorry?
What is the question again?
What's the significance of Abraham planting this tree and then calling on God as the everlasting God?
So the memorial.
The tree?
Yeah.
Yeah, oftentimes trees in the ancient world were considered sacred spots, places where you could meet with the deity. And this is another example, by the way, of a practice that the patriarchs had that's later condemned in the law of Moses. but in Abraham's time, it was still permitted. So he plants this tree as a sacred area where he can worship God. And so we're told that he calls on the name of the Lord. Hey, we've seen that expression a few times before. So we know that means worship, witness, all of those things. And why do you suppose he uses the name the everlasting God in this context?
Is it kind of because he knows God as like a God of covenants? He's like everlasting, everlasting covenant.
Yeah, I think so. So God is a God of covenant, and this is sort of a celebration that because God is everlasting, he can count on God to see that the covenant is not broken. Okay. God had even told Abraham that he was making an everlasting covenant with him back in chapter 17. So we're told that Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. Okay, end of chapter 21. So I promised you a slide that compares the two stories of Hagar and Ishmael. So you can see here, we don't have a chiasm. What we have are stories that are told in very similar order with similar themes and ideas. So it starts with Sarah's infertility in both stories. Well, sort of in 21. I mean, she is pregnant and she does give birth, but it's rejoicing that she's finally not infertile anymore. So, oh yeah, so Sarah's infertility in one, Sarah's fertility in the next. Sarah's response to these things, we read about Hagar's pregnancy and Ishmael being older, mocking Isaac. Sarah complains in both stories. Hagar is driven out. God speaks to Hagar, then in both stories through an angel of the Lord. He's called in one, angel of God in the second. The angel gives promises to Hagar to bless Ishmael and his descendants, and so on. I won't slavishly read every line there, but you can see that it's a lot of interesting parallels here between the two stories. Okay, thoughts or questions either on Abimelech or maybe even on something that has to do with the comparison of these two stories before we move on? You're happy, getting your money's worth, right? You or your parents have paid good money, so I just want to make sure you're getting your money's worth. You're welcome. Okay, so Genesis 22, of course, is a very famous story. The Jews call it the Akedah. Akedah means the binding, so the binding of Isaac. So anytime you might be talking to a Jewish person, if that happens, and if they happen to say something about the Akedah, then you know they're talking about Genesis 22 and the story where Abraham is commanded to offer up Isaac. A-K-E-D-A-H. All right. So let's start off here by reading verses 1 through 8.
1 through 8.
Yeah, back to you, Blake.
After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose, and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, and I will go with the boy. We'll go over there and worship and come to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father, Abraham, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together.
Okay, thank you. So in verses 1 through 8, we have the story of this shocking command, and then also we have the journey related. So we're told right up front in verse 1, it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham. So we know this is a test. Obviously, Abraham isn't told this by God. He's simply told to go take his son and offer him up as a burnt offering. I have a definition here of the word tested that I thought was pretty good. It comes from a Genesis commentary. Testing shows what someone is really like, and it generally involves difficulty or hardship. We usually show our true character and who we really are in difficult times. God tells the children of Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 8 that he caused them to walk in the wilderness so that he could test them, so he could know what was in their heart and to see if they would be obedient to him. So the wilderness, of course, involved a lot of difficulty and hardship. And God said, I purposely brought you into the wilderness in order to test you and see what's in your heart. So this is a test to Abraham to see what's in his heart. What I want to do is show you how this story has some parallels to the beginning call of Abraham back in chapter 12. When we laid out the big picture of Abraham's story, we noticed it had a chiastic structure to it. And I don't know if you remember, but I mentioned that this story of the offering up of Isaac had a number of similarities with the original call of Abraham. So in chapter 12 and verse 1, God called Abraham to go to a land that he would show him. And here, God gives the same command to Abraham. God tested him and said to him, Abraham, he said, here I am. He said, take now your son, your only son, and go to the land of Moriah. The words in Hebrew really sort of jump out at you because it's the only two places here in the Abraham story where the command is exactly the same. Literally, it's go for yourself. In Hebrew, it's lech lecha. And the reason I give you the Hebrew there is not so that you'll remember it, which I don't expect you to, but this particular expression has influenced some of our believing Israeli friends in the land of Israel. And there's actually a ministry that some of our former students have participated in. It's called Lech Lecha. And so the idea of go for yourself, in other words, be obedient to the Lord, go where the Lord is directing you to go. So they've taken it from these two stories, from Genesis 12:1, and then from here in Genesis 22. So this is a parallel command that reminds us of the same command that God gave Abraham in the beginning. Then, if you remember back in chapter 12, God told Abram to leave three things. He was to leave his country, his clan or his wider family, and his father's house, right? Well, here God says three things to Abram. He says, take your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac. Okay, so again, even the way God structures the command reminds us of what God said originally to Abraham. Obviously, it's a different command, but it's told in the same kind of format. So obviously, God wants us to compare these stories because there are these similarities. And if we look at the story of Abraham's call in chapter 12, and we compare it now with what Abraham's being asked to do, give me some of your thoughts. What can you derive from it?
Well, he does both. He
Okay,
follows through on each one.
so
He trusts God in both.
In both cases, we see Abraham's faithfulness to God under difficult circumstances, asked to do very difficult things. In the first one, he's supposed to give up family. And in this one, he's also supposed to give up family, right? What's different about the two families? Well, tell me about the one back in chapter 12. What do they represent?
They were Hebrews. They were chosen by God.
Yeah, okay. And so they were like father and brothers, right? Things like that. So they sort of represented Abraham's past, right? It's where he was from. And he was being commanded to separate where he had been from so that God could do a new thing. So to leave his past behind and trust God. What does Isaac represent? Isaac is the future. He's the promised seed. Everything that Abraham hopes for is in Isaac. And so there's a very strong contrast here. In the one story, God asks Abram to surrender his past. And in this story, he's asking Abraham to surrender his future. Wow. So we had talked about how sometimes when we become believers, God wants to separate us from things in our past. Sometimes it's people who've been a bad influence on us. Maybe it's certain places that we used to go that God no longer wants us to go there. It's a challenging thing to do, but in order for God to do a new work on us, it's important that we're obedient. But here, God says, do you love me enough, and do you trust me enough that you would even give up the future that I've promised you? This is a really hard one. Do we love God for who he is to the point where we can leave our future in his hands, even with certain things that we know he's promised us? Can we leave the future with him and surrender it? So this is part of the meaning of the test here. Now, some people have had a hard time with this passage because even though we're told it's a test, and obviously God is not going to allow Abraham to sacrifice his son, at this point, Abraham doesn't know that. And so it looks like God has commanded child sacrifice, okay? And so a lot of people say, this is a really bad image for the God of the Old Testament. What's going on here? Have you got any thoughts on that? How would you respond to someone who made that objection?
I mean, even when an angel comes and stops him, he says don't hurt him in any way. He's not just don't kill your son. He's just he goes above and beyond that. It's don't ever physically harm this kid. Protect it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So by the time we get to the end of the story, we know God's heart is certainly not to see any harm brought to Isaac. But some people would say this is still cruel and unusual punishment because Abraham has to go through this torture of thinking he's got to kill his son.
Although he does say God will provide.
Okay.
So maybe he even thinks maybe this is a test.
Okay.
God will provide a lamb for the burnt offering.
So he has an unwavering faith that somehow God's going to come through. We even have this statement back in verse 5 where he tells the young men who've come with him, stay here. I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. So I think this is where the writer of Hebrews gets the idea that Abraham was willing to offer up Isaac by faith, believing that even if Isaac was dead, that God would raise him from the dead. Now, what's Abraham's foundation for believing such a thing?
God kept his promise by giving him Isaac. So.
Yeah, and God had said, it's through Isaac your seed is going to be called. Oh, that Ishmael could live before you. No, I'll bless Ishmael, but it's through Isaac that your seed is going to be called. I think I read an article today. I'm going to give you I'll just put up the title of it now. I don't know if you can find this. I tried looking it up on Google, and you have to have access to this particular journal to read this article. But it's a really good article because what he argues is that you have to look at the whole context of the Abraham story to understand this story. God has proven himself over and over again to Abraham that he can be trusted. He's done miraculous things. He's delivered Abraham from Egypt and from a difficult situation with Abimelech. He has talked with Abraham about the destruction of Sodom, and he has seen God's justice, that God is willing to be merciful and not destroy if it can be prevented, and even willing to go the extra mile and save the very few that are righteous. He's given birth, allowed Abram and Sarah to give birth to a son for a woman whose menstrual periods had stopped, and yet miraculously they have a child. So when you look at the whole life experience of Abraham over the previous 25 years, God has shown himself to always take care of Abraham and his family, to always come through on his promises, and to even perform miracles on Abraham's behalf. And I think that's a pretty good argument then for understanding this. And as you point out in the verse you mentioned there, Blake, about how God will provide a lamb. And the verse that I mentioned, will come back to you after we've worshiped on the mountain. These are statements of faith by Abraham. He doesn't know how, but he has come to believe that he can trust the promises of God. And somehow he and Isaac are going to come back because God has promised him that Isaac is the seed through which God will bless the earth. Okay? So I think this is an important discussion to have because there certainly are people who are unbelievers these days who would want to attack God on this passage and say this is very vicious of God to do this. But taking the whole context of the story of Abraham in does make a big difference, I think. And that's what this fellow's arguing in this article. Now, it's often been pointed out that this story obviously has some interesting similarities with what God does with his own son, with Jesus. And this was pointed out by some of the early church fathers. So the New Testament doesn't use this story as a type of Christ, so we want to bear that in mind. But nonetheless, as many of the early church fathers read Genesis 22, they were like, wow, this sort of reminds us of what God did with his son, Jesus. So we have the sacrifice of an only son, a son whom God loved, right? Which is what the words that he uses here with Abraham. What other similarities do you see in the story? Have you guys ever heard this interpretation before? Yeah, I thought you probably had.
Almost mentioned it the third day.
Yes.
I looked up and saw.
I just had it.
He looked up and saw the place out which would be sacrificed.
Right. Verse 4.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, on the third day. So as Jesus was 3 days in the tomb, so Abram contemplates his son's death for 3 days. Okay, what else? Another interesting one.
Abraham puts the wood on Isaac.
Yeah. Abraham puts the wood on Isaac's back. Isaac carries the wood. And Isaac is a willing sacrifice. We don't know how old Isaac is at this point, but most Bible scholars believe that he's at least in his teens, which means if he wanted to fight off his elderly father, he certainly could have put up a fight. But he's totally passive in the story. He does ask, where's the lamb? But he doesn't seem to resist his father binding him and placing him on the altar. So just as Jesus is a willing sacrifice and lays down his life, so Isaac does the same. So I think these are legitimate parallels. Again, the New Testament doesn't take advantage of drawing on this story, but the early church fathers certainly did and saw these ideas as similar. So I want you to notice in the story too, again, we talk about the artistic way in which a lot of these stories are told. The story really slows down so that we can see every painful action and step that Abraham takes. Notice that in verse 3, we're told that Abram rose early, right? Every time he has a difficult task, he gets up early to do it. He saddled his donkey. He took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he arose to the place of which God had told him. So do we need to hear that he saddled his donkey? Do we need to hear that he split the wood? I mean, the story is really slowing down and showing us these painful moments. What must Abraham have been feeling and thinking as he saddles the donkey, as he splits the wood? Maybe hoping every step along the way, God's going to come and say, that's far enough, Abraham. You know, you don't have to sacrifice your son, but he doesn't. And then in verse 6, we're told how Abram took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. There's all the elements of the sacrifice. And so we're given a detailed, kind of a close-up, a zoom in of Abraham and Isaac going up the mountain, carrying the things that would ultimately kill Isaac if Abraham was to go through with the sacrifice. And then, Isaac, like any smart person would say, well, Dad, we've got everything we need for the sacrifice, but the sacrifice, where's that? Abraham must have rehearsed this answer in his mind. Like, what am I going to say when my son asks me this? And he says, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So pretty amazing reply here from Abraham. Now, of course, one of the big words in this story is this, or phrase really, is this idea that God will provide, right? This is, by the way, another name that we get for God. We'll come to it later on, so we'll talk about it later in the story when we get there. But the word provide here in Hebrew is the word to see. It comes from the Hebrew word to see. So because God is all-seeing, he knows what's going to come. He knows what's going to happen. Therefore, God can prepare and provide. When God tells Abraham to go to the land of Moriah, this word Moriah is from the Hebrew word to see. It's a noun that means the land of seeing, the land of provision. So he tells Abraham, go to the land of provision. And when they get there and they're going up the mountain, and Isaac says, God bless you. No, Isaac didn't say God bless you, but I'm saying that. Isaac says, Dad, where's the lamb? Abraham, who's in the land of provision, says, my son, the Lord will provide. Okay, anything else before we move on? Okay, let's look at verses 9 through 19. Luke?
Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. He bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by thorns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing, I will bless you, and multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham dwelt at Beersheba.
Okay, so back to verse 9. Notice again verses 9 and 10. It's almost like slow motion. We're seeing every little thing. Built the altar, placed the wood on the altar, bound Isaac, stretched out his hand with the knife. Okay, sometimes when the Bible recounts a story, it recounts it very quickly. Okay, there was this battle and Israel defeated the Philistines. And we move on, We're like, but we want details. What went on? What happened? Here we get the details. Okay, every excruciating detail. And as Abraham's hand is lifted up to slay his son, this is when the angel of the Lord calls out. So notice we have the angel of the Lord again in the story. And he tells him not to lay a hand on the lad or do anything to him. What do you think it means for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me? Could God not have known this before? I thought God knew everything and could see into people's hearts. So what's going on with this statement?
Faith without works is dead.
Oh,
So, he knew Abraham had the faith, but this is the action of his.
yeah. Faith is always backed up by works, isn't it? By obedience. And it's great that you would quote that particular passage, Aoife, because James uses this example, doesn't he? To demonstrate, that Abraham showed his faith by his works, by his willingness to offer up his son. And this is important because, of course, God knew that Abraham had faith in him. But by fulfilling the action and being obedient to the command, no one could look back at Abraham and say, well, how do we know that Abraham really had the faith? Look at the times that he goofed up. So how do we know? And God could always point back to this as the seal of approval that, hey, if you doubt at all that Abraham had faith in me, look at this, okay? So this demonstrates to all that Abraham did indeed totally trust the Lord. Okay, so in this story, we have 2 sacrifices followed by 2 messages from the Lord. First, we have Isaac being offered up, and that's followed by the message here in verses 11 and 12. God, praising Abraham, telling him not to lay his hand on the child. Now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham had said, my son, the Lord will provide a lamb. And it's right after this, what happens? Abraham lifts up his eyes, and what does he see? He sees a ram with his horns caught in the thicket. Okay? Again, remember how important the word see is to the story here. So Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So he had said, God will provide, God will see, and indeed God causes Abraham here to see that in fact he has provided the sacrifice as Abraham had told Isaac he would. And so that the second sacrifice then in verses 13 and 14 is going to be followed by another word from the Lord in 15 through 18. But before we look at 15 through 18, I want to notice what Abraham says here in verse 14. And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide. Okay, another name for God. In English, some of our English Bibles, what's the words here? You know, Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. In Hebrew, it's Yahweh Yireh. You don't have to worry about writing that one out. But know that this is yet another name for God in these early chapters of Genesis. So we're really getting a well-rounded picture of who God is. He's a God who sees. He's a God who's everlasting. He's a God who provides. He's a God who's almighty or shows fruitfulness, makes people fruitful. He's a God who is most high. We've had all of these different ways of describing who God is in these early chapters of Genesis. So as I mentioned then in verses 15 through 18, we have really God celebrating and confirming the promises that he's already made to Abraham, but God does something different here that I want us to catch. So verse 15, the angel of the Lord called to Abram a second time out of heaven. Now listen to this. By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, as the sand which is on the seashore, and your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Now God's made these promises before, and we know that God keeps his promises, but here God swears an oath. Okay, so you can't make your promise any more sure if you're God than swearing an oath that you're going to do this. And as I said, everything that God mentions here are promises that we've seen him make to Abraham before. We may not have seen the one, your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. So that might be a new little wrinkle. But this idea of multiplying his descendants, and then most importantly, verse 18, in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So this is the third time we've heard that promise. Okay. So the story ends with Abraham returning to the young men, Abraham and Isaac, and then returning home to Beersheba. Okay. All right, that gets us to 10 minutes to the hour, so we can take our next break, okay? See you guys in 10 minutes. Okay, so the chapter finishes with verses 20 through 24, which sets us up for the introduction of Rebekah. So we have a lineage, a further lineage of Abraham's family, and the most important member mentioned here will be Rebekah. So, whose turn? Okay, Karina.
Sometime later, Abraham was told, Milcah is also a mother. She has borne sons to your brother Nahor. Uz, the firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel, the father of Aram, Isad, Hazo, Hudash, Zidlaf, and Bethuel. Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. Milcah bore these 8 sons to Abraham's brother Nahor. His concubine, whose name was Reumah, also had sons, Heba, Gaham, Tosh, and Ma.
One of the good things about the Genesis genealogies is it gives you a lot of ideas for baby names. I love Huz and Buzz. They're my favorite. If any of you have twins, it's got to be Huz and Buzz, right?
That's my big takeaway from Genesis.
There you go. Yeah, it's good. Okay. Now, if you count up how many descendants are listed here, guess how many there are?
Guess or count?
Give me a guess. There's 12. There's 12. Yeah. So we have 12 descendants for Ishmael. And we have Abraham's brother having 12 descendants listed. And of course, later on, Jacob is going to have 12 descendants. Now, it's unusual sorry, ladies, but it's unusual in these genealogies for women to be mentioned, but Rebecca is specifically mentioned. We don't know why yet if we've never read Genesis before, but her name is highlighted here, and we'll soon learn why when we get to chapter 24. So the three branches of Abraham's family are actually reunited in the marriage of Rebecca to Isaac. So Rebecca is the daughter of Bethuel, who is the son of Nahor, Abraham's brother. Does that make sense? So Rebecca's the granddaughter of Nahor, Abraham's brother. But Nahor had married Milcah, and Milcah was the daughter of his brother Haran. So this reunites, when Rebecca marries Isaac, this reunites all three branches of Abraham's family through them. So Jacob and Esau, in other words, are from the bloodlines of all three people in Abraham's family, if that makes sense. I have another slide that gives us some interesting similarities that I want to share with you. There's also a similar structure between the story of Isaac and the previous story of Ishmael. So this is interesting. We talked about how it's good to ask yourself the question, how does this chapter relate to the previous chapter? Are there connections? And here we see a lot of them. So God orders Ishmael's expulsion. God orders Isaac's sacrifice. Both happen early in the morning. That is, Abraham reacts early in the morning. Food and water taken, sacrificial materials taken. There's journeys in both. Ishmael about to die, Isaac about to die, angel of God, angel of the Lord. This idea of fear, God is heard, etc., etc. So very interesting. Once again, we've seen that first story here of Ishmael, the one in 21, compares also to 16, but then it also compares here to the Isaac story in many ways. So again, just extraordinary inspired artistry, okay? I don't think anyone writes a story better than God. Okay, you ready for chapter 23? Yes, you are. Okay, well, now this is a sad chapter. We're going to kill off Sarah. All right, so verses 1 through 6.
Are we doing 24?
No, this is it. We're on the last leg.
Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, that is Hagar, in the land of Canaan. Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep. Then Abraham stood up from before his dead and spoke to the Cenotaphs, saying, I am a foreigner and a visitor among you. Give me property for a burial place among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And the sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, Here is my Lord, you are a mighty prince in my eyes. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial. None of us will withhold you from his burial place that you may bury.
Okay, so in verse 1, Sarah lived 127 years. These are the years of the life of Sarah. Did you know that Sarah is the only woman whose age is given at her death in the whole Bible? It's because women don't like to tell their age. But she's the matriarch of Israel, and so it's a significant event. And if we look at the idea of numerology, numbers having meanings and symbols, we have, first of all, we could take 120 years, was often considered like the ideal age to die at. For instance, Moses dies at 120 years. And then Sarah lives beyond that, this symbolic number of 7 years. So she lives like the perfect lifespan plus 7 more years. So that's not to say the numbers aren't literal, but also that they apparently have some symbolic significance behind them as well. So she dies in Hebron, and notice we're given the old name of the city plus the new name of the city. And Abram mourns for her, and then, of course, he's got no place to bury her, right? He's a stranger in the land. So he speaks to the people in the area, who are called the sons of Heth, and asks for property to bury his dead. And what do they respond to him?
So he's a mighty man in the land.
Yeah, they call him a mighty prince, or this is the word Elohim here. So some translations will say a prince of God. But sometimes Elohim is used as an adjective to mean great or mighty. So here's that passage I was talking about where Abraham is sort of recognized as a royal figure, a mighty prince or a prince of God. And what do they then tell him?
You can have the choices of their burial spots.
Right. So why isn't that good enough for Abraham? Because we're going to see he goes on to negotiate for a burial spot. No idea?
Like he doesn't want them to have any like sway over him. Like, oh well, we gave you this nice tomb. What are you gonna do for us? Or like, oh well, that's actually our tomb now. Like we just give it to you for some time or whatever. Something like that.
Yeah, excellent, Chris. I think that's exactly it. Abraham wants to own the property so that he can not only bury Sarah there, but so that he can be buried there, and as we'll see, future descendants can be buried there. So he doesn't want to be given land, because land that's given can always be said, well, it's not yours. We just allowed you to bury your wife there. So he wants to own the land. So in the coming verses then, verses 7 through 20, we have this negotiation that takes place between Abraham and a certain fellow whose land Abraham desires to purchase. So let's go ahead and read 7 through 20.
Abraham bowed low before the Hittites and said, since you are willing to help me in this way, be so kind as to ask Ephron, son of Zohar, to let me buy his cave at Machpelah, down at the end of his field. I will pay the full price in the presence of witnesses, so I will have a permanent burial place for my family. Ephron was sitting there among the others, and he answered Abraham as the others listened, speaking publicly before all the Hittite elders of the time. No, my lord, he said to Abraham, please listen to me. I will give you the field and the cave, here in the presence of my people. I will give it to you. Go and bury your dead. Abraham again bowed low before the citizens of the land. And he replied to Ephron, as everyone listened, now listen to me. I will buy it from you. Let me pay the full price for the field so I can bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, my lord, please listen to me. The land is worth 400 pieces of silver, but what is that between friends? Go ahead and bury your dead. So Abraham agreed to Ephron's price, and we paid the amount he had suggested, 400 pieces of silver, weighed according to the market standard. The Hittite elders witnessed the transaction. So Abraham bought the plot of land belonging to Ephron at Machpelah near Mamre. This included the field itself, the cave that was in it, and all the surrounding trees. It was transferred to Abraham as his permanent possession in the presence of the Hittite elders at the city gate. Then Abraham buried his wife Sarah there in Canaan, in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, also called Hebron. So the field and the cave were transferred from the Hittites to Abraham for use as a permanent burial place.
Notice how much repetition we have there. Just emphasizing that Abraham bought this property in the cave of Machpelah. So what's the deal here? Abraham comes and he tells them that he wants the property that belongs to Ephron. So Ephron comes, and what does he say?
So let me give it to you.
Yeah. So it's that same old thing, right?
400 shekels between friends.
Yeah. So he starts off with saying, just take it, my lord, But Abraham doesn't want to be in his debt, and he wants to own the property outright. So Abraham comes back and insists that he'll buy it. So Ephron, in a good Middle Eastern way, he doesn't just come out and state the price. It's just like, well, what's 400 shekels between friends, Now, if you look at property as it's bought in other times in the Old Testament, this seems to be an exorbitant amount. For instance, David buys the Temple Mount. Oh, I forget what the price now is, but it's somewhere like 30 to 50 shekels. This is 400 shekels.
For a cave.
Yeah, for a cave in the fields around it. So it's not just the cave, but still. Seems to be an exorbitant price. And probably what Ephron, he was probably doing one of two things. Either putting the price so high that he thought he would discourage Abraham from wanting to buy it, or expecting Abraham to bargain with him. So he's going to start high so that when he comes down, he can still make a good profit. But Abraham doesn't bargain with him at all. 400 shekels, you got it. And he purchases the cave in the field. And as we mentioned, it's emphasized over and over and over again. Because outside of the well that Abraham dug in Beersheba, this now becomes the first piece of property that he actually owns in the land of Canaan. So it's symbolic for the fact that Abraham's descendants will one day own this land, and he now has a foothold, a toehold at least, in the land, and he has a place to bury himself and Sarah, and as we'll see, some of the other descendants who come from him. Kristen? Oh, thought you were raising your hand. Okay. So I wanted to show you some pictures, maps, show you where Hebron is located in case you don't know, and then look at some modern day photos of Hebron. So on the right-hand side is a blow-up. You can see Hebron there much easier. You'll notice it's south of Jerusalem, and it overlooks the Dead Sea. So if you go to the bigger map of Israel, but smaller print, you can find Hebron by looking about the middle of the Dead Sea where it says En-Gedi, and just go up from En-Gedi and you'll see that's where Hebron is. I wanted to give you both maps because I wanted you to see where Hebron is in relation to all of Israel, but yet the print's so small that I wanted to give you the blow-up map so you could also get an idea of where it is. So it's actually in the highest point of the hill country here. So Jerusalem's about 3,000 feet up in the mountains, but Hebron is just a little bit higher. It's either 31 or 3,300 feet up. Okay, so it's in a mountainous area. Now here's a modern view of Hebron. So you can see the modern city all around, but right in the center of the picture, you see this structure, and this structure has been built around the ancient cave of Machpelah to memorialize where the patriarchs were buried. Now, who built this structure? Anybody know? Okay, next slide. Closer up picture. Herod the Great built this building over the cave of the patriarchs. So this building goes back to the 1st century BC, built by evil King Herod, who slaughtered the infants of Bethlehem. But to memorialize the place where the ancestors were buried, he built this building over it. So today, you can go to Hebron and visit this site, but it's in the West Bank, and it's sort of a political hotbed. And there's frequently some violent outbursts that take place there, but both Jews and Muslims go in to pay their respects because, of course, the Muslims also trace their ancestry back to Abraham. Here's a picture of what at least part of the inside looks like. You can see it's been very ornately decorated. And the two boxes on either side of the slide, those things are called cenotaphs. And I have a description here on the slide what a cenotaph is. A cenotaph is a tomb-like monument to someone buried elsewhere. These cenotaphs were built around the 8th century AD. Okay, but they memorialize the fact that the patriarchs are buried in this spot, not in these particular cenotaphs, but in the cave underneath the building. Okay. So you can't go down into the cave these days. That would cause a lot of political and religious controversy for archaeologists to go down there and do that. But I wish they could. But you can visit this area today. Never been there, but I'd love to be able to go someday.
Do you know how certain they are this is the right cave?
I've never heard anyone dispute it, is all I can say. Okay. So, any time I've read anything, whether it's a Bible scholar or an archaeologist, no one says, well, this might be the cave or it might not be. Everybody says it is. So they seem pretty certain. Okay. Anything else? Okay, guess what? We've reached our destination again tonight. So on Friday, tomorrow night, we'll look at chapters 24, 25, 26, and 27. Okay?
That's some good stories.
Got some good stories coming up tomorrow. Yes, exactly. Okay, so God bless you guys. Have a good evening. You're welcome.